like giving food to the hungry, giving hope to the needy, giving life to a baby, giving care for free, 'cause there's freedom around us. We have everything we need, and I will care for you, 'cause you care for me. And we all have opinions, and some of them get through, but there's better people with more good to do, good to do.
Welcome to another Catholic Worker to Be Better People video, and today's topic is going to be on pacifism, especially Christian pacifism, Catholic pacifism. And to kick us off, we're going to have Jim talk about the development of his beliefs around this.
Hello everyone. I'd like to talk about how I come to my views on pacifism, where I stand on my Christian faith and pacifist ideals. I guess I've always had a leaning towards non-violence and peace long before I ever heard about them. But then once I became aware of the Catholic worker movement, when I was in my mid-20s, I discovered a movement that embraced the ideals of Jesus, which had been abandoned largely by the church for the last 1700 years. I think it's pretty obvious to anyone reading the Gospels with an open mind that Jesus would never endorse killing our enemies. He said clearly to love your enemies, do good to those who hate you and to those who persecute you. And when he himself was being taken away to be executed, he gave a clear admonition to St. Peter to put away your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And there is absolutely nothing in the Gospels, despite people's futile and facile attempts to find them, absolutely no instances where Jesus condones violence, let alone killing your enemies. So, for the first 300 years of Christianity, this was obvious to all Christians. I once spoke to a theologian who I do have great respect for, who tried to tell me that there was debate about the issue even for the first 300 years. But that was many years ago I spoke to him. But since then, I've never come across anyone who can show me one side of the debate where people, for the first 300 years, any bishops or leaders condoned killing others in war. There was some debate about whether someone could be a soldier and a Christian, but it was clear that, from what I read, the person who said it was possible said as long as you didn't kill anyone. And of course this is impossible for a soldier in modern times. So after 300 years of following Jesus' teachings on love and non-violence, along comes Constantine and the betrayal of the church to the state. Constantine had supposedly had a miraculous vision of going to battle against his enemy with a cross, seeing a cross. That led him to believe that if he put a cross on the shields or the insignia, he would win in battle. And then the church went from being a persecuted church to a part of the state, which it has been for the last 1700 years, when it comes to militarism at least. So I guess, like I've said, the issue seems quite simple to me. If you are a follower of Jesus, you can't kill your enemies. But of course, I'm in a very small minority of Christians around the world who believe this. Well, I'd like to say that all the debates I've had, all discussions I've had since being part of the Catholic worker movement, my position being clear to everyone who meets me, and everything I've read, everyone, and up until quite recently, everyone advocating the just war theory, and everyone advocating the right or even the duty of Christians to join the military, fight for their country, etc. When you debate, no matter whether it is with a devout Christian or a priest or a bishop. The other side only seems to quote pragmatic reasons for the necessity of Christians killing for the greater good, to protect the innocent, to protect the weak, etc., etc. No one appeals to the teachings of Jesus, despite their positions as preachers teaching about Jesus and leading Jesus' flock or whatever. Some of the facile explanations pretending that Jesus condoned violence is the telling the disciples to buy a sword. For whatever reason, you can work out that he did this. There is certainly no indication that he told them to buy a sword to hurt anyone with it. That's for sure. Because as soon after, when he told them to buy a sword, he told Peter to put away his sword, and those who live by the sword will die by the sword. One could perhaps explain his decision, his request for them to buy a sword, that he was going to point out that they shouldn't be using the sword. It makes a lot more sense than the theory that he told them to buy a sword so they could go and kill people with it. Yeah, there's a few other facile attempts to pretend that Jesus would condone the killing of your enemies, but I won't bother to go into them. They're so pathetic. So I believe the only true path for a Christian is to renounce violence, and especially to renounce the killing of our enemies. Of course, the Old Testament, yes. I should point out that whilst no one has any ability to present a coherent explanation of Jesus condoning warfare or killing your enemies, people often or usually turn to the Old Testament, which of course contains enormous accounts of violence and even of God causing the death of many people, or God advocating the killing of Israel's enemies, etc., etc. How can I explain this? I can't explain this change. Others have attempted to explain. I've read explanations from pacifists, but myself, I'm happy to remain ignorant of the explanation for this. But we're not Christians are not Jews. As much as we have respect for Jews as our brothers in so many ways, and we have utmost respect for the Old Testament and the truth of it, our instructions on how to live as Christians are to be found in the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus. That is clear. It's clear that we can't be involved in warfare and killing. It's so very, very clear. So Jesus taught us to love our enemies, but he also spent a life speaking out and struggling against injustice, advocating for the poor, and giving us instructions on how to live simply and make the world a better place, I believe. So his message of loving your enemies, doing good to those who hate you, etc., while at the same time refusing to cooperate with violence and injustice, led many people to form the concept of non-violent resistance. Gandhi is the most famous, of course. Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, all practice what is nowadays commonly known as non-violence. Gandhi famously said that Christians are the only ones who could possibly read the Gospels and believe that Jesus condoned violence. And Gandhi himself, though a Hindu, was inspired by the scriptures, especially on the Sermon on the Mount, inspired by Leo Tolstoy, who also, the famous Russian who advocated non-violence. He managed to drive out the British with non-violent resistance. The British were, some people say that he could achieve this because the British were somehow civilised, but the British had no qualms about killing countless Indians and Afghanis and others in their imperial quests. So Gandhi then inspired Martin Luther King in his campaign of non-violence to overthrow the racist laws and the racist injustices in America. And his many successes are an inspiration to us all still today. Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, also engaged in non-violent resistance. She was jailed a number of times for supporting causes such as the Farm Workers Union, and for resisting nuclear warfare by refusing to go to a fallout shelter in New York when commanded by the government in a practice for the possibility of nuclear war. And Catholic worker folks have been using non-violent resistance against injustice and violence since the foundation of the movement in the 30s. And here in Brisbane, Australia, I've been involved in numerous campaigns of non-violent resistance, putting our bodies on the line, refusing to, at the same time refusing to use violence to overcome injustice. Yeah, so people always who are supporting the just war theory, supporting armed violence, supporting war, always try to pretend that that pacifists do nothing in response to injustice or violence. No matter how much you try to convince people that non-violence is a very active strategic resistance to violence, they try to ignore this fact and paint pacifists as people do nothing and letting injustice and oppression go on. So, but this is not the truth, and we need to convince people somehow that non-violence is effective, as well as for Christians demanded by Jesus whether or not it's successful or not. But we also need to convince people that non-violence works. I think Joan Baez famously said the only thing in the history of the world which has been a greater failure than non-violence has been the history of violence. And I believe that's so true. Non-violent campaigns have overcome oppressors and invaders numerous occasions. The evil Russian Empire was overthrown by non-violent campaign of resistance that eventually overturned communism. Various other places, dictators have been overthrown, military dictators like Marcos in the Philippines and Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia in recent history. And I strongly believe in non-violent resistance to violence and injustice. And that's what I've been involved in the last 30 years, been to jail numerous times myself. And yeah, so I have been involved. It's very hard to point out campaigns that have been involved and been a great success. Militarism rages on in our country to an ever greater extent. But one instance I would say where non-violence has been successful that I've been heavily involved in is a campaign for the freedom of East Timor. The East Timor resistance under Sinana Gusmao waged a war against Indonesia for nearly 20 years, and thousands of Indonesians were killed, and many more thousands of East Timoris were killed in this violent conflict, of course. But what eventually overthrew the Indonesian occupation was a non-violent campaign around the world to point out the horrors of their occupation. And some of us in Brisbane were actively involved in that campaign for many years, blockading the training of Indonesians at Kananga military base, occupying the boardroom of the Petrise oil companies, which was stealing oil from East Timor under a contract with Indonesia, occupying the Foreign Affairs Department and the Defence Department. When Indonesian generals would visit Australia in 1991, the Dili Massacre occurred, which was a non-violent group of students went to the cemetery to mourn the death of someone killed by the Indonesian military. And at the end of that burial, they held banners and placards decrying the Indonesian military occupation. The Indonesian military killed up to 300 people on that day. No East Timorese fought back that I'm aware of. No one had guns or weapons to fight this murderous occupation. However, someone did have a camera and they filmed what happened, and that film went around the world. And when people saw the non-violent resistance of these students, the people around the world rose up and demanded the end of the Indonesian occupation. So that was a campaign of non-violence that overthrew a murderous, brutal regime in East Timor. So the weapons of non-violence are prayer, fasting, non-violent resistance are the ones that are open to us as Christians. And even if we get crucified, we can't kill our enemies. We are called to love our enemies. Thank you.
So I have a couple of things to add to what Jim has said. The first in terms of the Old Testament and the New Testament, that the Old Testament Jews were a covenant people, used by God to be a light to the nations and a people into whom the Messiah would be born. Once the Messiah was born, Jesus talked about a new covenant in his blood. And he said it was new, and that you couldn't put old wine into new wineskins, showing that a lot of the Old Testament ways weren't going to fit in with his new ways, such as his teachings on marriage and his teachings about violence, both of which were a break from the old and a new way of operating in the world. His only interaction that he had, to the Jews' dismay, with the brutal Roman Empire that had invaded his country and that they were living under the oppression of, his only way that he interacted with those soldiers was to heal for them or to heal them. When Peter cut off the soldier's ear, who may have been a temple guard and not a Roman soldier, but he cut off the soldier's ear and Jesus healed him. And this is a message to veterans of today, that Jesus is available to them for healing. Come to him. He wants to do that for you. He was always, as Jim said, very clear about the use of violence. A lot of people talk about the Christians, the early Christians, and one of the ironic things is that one of our saints, St. Martin of Tours, who is one of the patron saints of soldiers, himself also was a soldier, and I think a Roman soldier, and he became a Christian and realised he had to stop being a soldier and become a soldier for Christ. And St. Paul himself pointed out how to be a soldier for Christ, and he does not talk about using a physical sword, but a sword of truth, and wearing salvation as a helmet, and faith as your breastplate, and I don't know it all off by heart, but you can look it up. And that's how the Christians operated in terms of arming themselves against the world and against the violence of the world. The last century, sadly, was a huge century of war waging and violence, but it was also a century of non-violent resistance and successful non-violent resistance that children in our schools and us ourselves know very little about. Thanks to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a series of DVDs were put together, really well done, outlining some of these successful campaigns that Jim mentioned, such as the Philippine overthrow of Marcos, the Serbian overthrow of Milosevic, also the Chilean overthrow of Pinochet, and Jim mentioned the East Timorese as well. So last century was also an amazing century, as well as Gandhi and Martin Luther King, an amazing century of experiments with non-violence and successful campaigns. So we have already in our history, as well as through our faith, examples and hope, I suppose, hope that has been given to us by history and by our teachings, that non-violence will work ultimately. As Martin Luther King famously said, Our choice is between non-violence or non-existence. Now they're talking about robotics in war waging. Like, what are we doing? We're creating hell on earth for everybody. Lastly, I just thought I'd mention St. Francis of Assisi, another famous saint in our church, who was also very much against the waging of war and violence in war, and was, as a result of that, his experience in that led to him becoming the man he was and the great saint he was. He effectively stopped war waging between the city-states in Italy today as we know it, by telling people who became Third Order Franciscans that they couldn't bear arms. So the lords and the city-states no longer had soldiers, and that was the end of it. And I guess that is also the message today. About, apparently there was a lot of military disobedience that ended the Vietnam War as well, that American soldiers just stopped obeying and stopped killing. That's a little known piece of history as well. But there's also been a documentary made about that called Yes Sir, No Sir, I believe. So we have got our saints, we have got our New Testament, and we have got our own faith and hope in these teachings and in the saints that have preceded us. So pray for us, Dorothy Day, Peter Moran, and St. Francis of Assisi, and St. Martin of Tours, and many others. Amen.